Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our fifth or sixth.
I think we've lost
count of how many virtual wine tastings we've done. But we've got a real treat this afternoon. We're taking part in the Virginia Wineries special, whereby we're being encouraged to drink rosé, and we're celebrating Rosé Week.
Because on Saturday, the 13th, it's International Rosé Day. So today we're featuring rosé, and this week we've also featured as our case special or our house special rosé. It's $175 for a case of rosé, which is a steal.
And such a deal.
And should stock you up for a few weeks, maybe a few days, depending on your household. So that special will be available until Monday. So if you haven't already gotten a case of rosé, I encourage you to do so and celebrate International Rosé Day with us on Saturday.
Excellent, Emily. Thank you. The thing about rosé is that it really is an everyday wine. You can drink rosé with hamburgers. You can drink rosé with caviar, from one extreme to the other. And it's the nice thing about rosé is its informality, and it's not a wine that you have to give a lot of energy to. But yet again, there are, if you want to pay money, you can go up the scale and get really quite sophisticated rosés from various regions around the world. The real birthplace of rosé is in France, and Provence, the Languedoc-Roussillon, Loire Valley, and the Rhone Valley are famous for their rosé wines. Some of the rosé wines are sweet, most are dry. And Emily's going to tell us how she uses our grapes to make our rosé. Now, Emily, just answer this question for me. Is rosé a white wine or is it a red wine?
Oh, that was a question for later. But yes, I'm happy to answer that now. Technically, rosé is a red wine because it is made entirely from red grapes. So our rosé is 50% Cabernet Franc and 50% Merlot. There's a lot of different reasons why it's pink, and that all has to do with winemaking technique and the style in which we make rosé. So not to bore you with wine geek details, but I do really enjoy making rosé and all the different technical aspects of it and what that builds into our wine. So we are going to talk a little bit today about the two ways in which we make rosé. And what I love about rosé is that it spans from light pink to darker styles of rosé.
Yeah.
And some of that is just to do with the grape you decide to use. For example, Cabernet Franc typically has a much lighter color no matter what you do, but a grape, for example, Syrah, would have a much darker color because that's just the nature of the grape.
Right.
But in a nutshell, you want to talk about the two different techniques, and then I'll talk about...
Yes, there are two different techniques. Typically, if you buy a French rosé, the regulations say that the wine has to be made by what is called macerating or bleeding the wine. And Emily's going to elaborate on that for us. If you really want to take it to an extreme, there is a third method in which one simply mixes red wine with white wine.
Which is typically frowned upon, because
yes.
That's not... The birthplace of rosé was always just a light skin contact and a pressing off of red grapes.
But the funny thing is, the only place in Europe where they allow that is in Champagne. So when you get a pink champagne is a red wine added to a champagne.
Which is not what we do here at Veritas.
True.
So we have two techniques. I'll start with the first one because it's the basis of where we started, and that's saigner. And saigner is a French term which literally means to bleed. And I brought a few props to help explain that, and I'll get to that. So what do I mean by to bleed? If you can imagine, we're in harvest and we're looking at red grapes, Cab Franc and Merlot, and we've decided to harvest, let's say, Cabernet Franc. And we bring in those grapes, and those are the perfect maturity for a big, full-bodied red. We bring in those grapes, we destem them, which means you take all the berries off the stems, and we put them into a stainless steel tank, very similar to my miniature version.
Terrific.
And so if you can imagine, and I'll just move a few things. This tank is full up to the top. Our tanks are 8-ton tanks. This is not. The tank is filled up to the very, very tippy top with red grapes. So the grapes at the bottom are actually getting squished and crushed with the weight of all the other grapes on top of them. So we have all the grapes in the tank. We'll leave them overnight, and that's anywhere from 16 to 20 to 24 hours. Then what we do, and when we put the red grapes into the tank, immediately the juice has no color. It's just an barely off pink. I'm going to say kind of like, Dad's okay, don't worry. He just got a tickle in his throat.
I do apologize.
So then what we do is basically we'll open the bottom valve of the tank, and I know you can't see this, but what we do is we let out the juice out of the tank. We'll take out anywhere from 10 to 25% of the juice, and the juice that comes out after the skin contact, and that's what happened overnight, the juice was in contact with the skin, we'll get this beautiful light pink colored juice. Now, the reason we do that is not to make rosé. The reason we do that is so that this beautiful 8-ton tank of Cabernet Franc has just a little bit less liquid, so that the red wine that we make that remains has more tannins, more color, concentrated, more structure, because we've taken just a little bit of the liquid volume out. But, bonus, we get this gorgeous pink rosé. So about half of our rosé is made in this method, the saignée or the bleed.
Yeah.
Now, the other half, remove props. The other half is made with a technique in which we're not harvesting the grapes for a red wine. We're actually harvesting them specifically for rosé.
Yeah.
So what that means is we're looking at beautiful acid structure. We're looking at reds maybe just a little before we pick them for a red wine, a little less alcohol, a little less color, a little less tannins. And what that brings to the wine is brightness, freshness. So the two styles, the saignée and the maceration, or just
crushing, really.
You basically just press the red grapes. The saignée, it has much more fruit character. The saignée is also barrel fermented because it's smaller lots. We're only taking out 10 to 20% at a time, so it has a little more structure, a little bit more fruit, and then the grapes that we pick directly for rosé have that acid freshness and that brightness, and the two blended together, I think we found a really nice sweet spot.
Right. Not that the wine is sweet.
It's not sweet. No.
But it is a sweet spot.
Yes.
A lot of rosés are in fact sweet.
Well, not a lot.
Well,
most are dry.
Yeah. Except White Zinfandel, perhaps.
Well, but I wouldn't put White Zin in.
White Zin.
Yeah, I would consider White Zin.
Is it actually? Well, I tell you what people call it. They call it a blush.
A blush, yes.
You blush because you're embarrassed by the way you made it. as a winemaker.
And actually, rosé had a bad name for many, many years.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously now it is very popular. But for a while, people always assumed if they saw this pink color that it was going to be a sweet pink wine.
Right.
And a lot of that had to do with the birth of White Zinfandel as a style of wine. But
and also, Emily, you probably won't remember, but a lot of my generation remember a thing called Mateus Rosé. And Mateus Rosé was actually a Portuguese rosé. And people used to buy the wine and save the bottle, which was always covered in straw, and stick a candle in it. And Mateus Rosé was the sort of wine you drank if you were an undergraduate and you didn't want anybody else to know that you were drinking wine. So Mateus Rosé did give rosé rather a bad rap to start with, but things have really improved now. And I think rosé is one of there's two wines that are increasing their market share. One is rosé, and the other one, believe it or not, is still sparkling wine. Sparkling wine is increasing its market share, as is rosé, whereas the rest of the varieties and types and styles of white and red wine, the sales are remaining pretty much flat.
Right. So we talked earlier about a rosé being a very versatile wine. Oh, and let me back up a second. I forgot this week, as I did our last live tasting, that we want this to be very interactive. So if you have any questions, please send them in. Let us know. We have Becca here with us again today, so she's our technical genius, and she will help us answer all your questions. But a question I often get, maybe not specifically for rosé, but for many wines, is, what's your favorite food pairing with rosé? And that's a hard one, actually, for a rosé, but I thought it would be fun just to kind of, for us both to think about. And I think one of my favorite rosé pairings is carnitas, so like a soft shell taco with carnitas, sour cream, cilantro, lime.
Wow.
All, with the sort of the fatty nature of carnitas and the flour tortilla and everything. And maybe that's also just the time of year, outside having carnitas.
Yes.
It's one of my favorite rosé food pairings. I know I kind of put you on the spot, but do you have a favorite rosé?
I like rosé, to be honest, with things like hamburgers, with informal food, salads, sometimes with fresh fruit salad, just enhance the strawberries, the raspberries, and the bright acidity. I mean, I think Emily's distinction between the fruit-forward rosé, which is much more textural, and the paler wine, which is the direct crush or the short maceration wine, is the sort of brighter, more acidic, and the redder wine is the one that Emily picks when the red grapes are completely ripe.
Yep.
And there's a big contrast between those two.
We have a visual.
Oh, we have a visual.
Yes, sorry, one more prop.
When is a rosé a rosé?
So when we're, as we're going through harvest, one of my favorite things and one of my favorite pictures every year is, for example, the first Cab Franc that comes in, if we bleed that's rosé 1. And then if we pick another Cab Franc and we do a direct press, that's rosé 2. And then we might have a Merlot, that's rosé 3. And it's very interesting throughout the course of the year. We have this array of colors of all the rosés, so they don't all come in as this blend or as this typical rosé color that you see.
They may start there, and then by halfway through harvest they're there.
Yep.
And perhaps at the end of harvest, when we're doing Tannat or something like that.
Much darker.
Yes. Yeah. So one of the things that when we first started making wine together, we used to spend so much energy making our rosé because
it was difficult.
We had so many different batches, and we'd have like batch number 10 rosé, and we would spend hours trying to make it better and get the right components together so that we'd have this wine, which has always been a favorite. I mean, it's always been
one of our favorites.
Yeah, pretty much every year we sell out of rosé before the end of the season, don't we? And it's
just can't make enough.
It's a great deal. Yeah.
So yes, when we're doing each batch of rosé, they range in color. This is actually, my dad brought this back when he was in Provence, one of the sort of original rosé regions in France.
Yeah.
And they actually specifically name each color so that when you go to describe your rosé, you kind of line it up on the chart and say, well, I think this actually matches up with mango. Mangosteen, I think it says.
Yeah.
But this just reminds me of exactly what it looks like in the cellar as we look at each batch of rosé that we have. Once they're all blended together, from year to year, the overall color might change. But for the most part, the final blend is this beautiful light rose-colored wine.
And sometimes the rosé will take on this slightly orangey color, and it's sort of a salmon pink. The French have a term for it. They call it the eye of the partridge, because apparently the eye of a partridge is a very pale rose color.
Very pale pink.
Enough talking. Shall we taste?
Yes, please.
Yes.
One of the things that I feel conveys year to year in our rosé is this beautiful, soft strawberry aroma. I think a lot of that comes from the saignée, the skin contact from the ripe fruit. And what I love about that, it's kind of counterintuitive because the fruit is riper, so you think it wouldn't be as fruity. But because we don't actually squeeze that fruit, because we actually just let the juice run off of that fruit, it's like first press olive oil. It's a free run.
It's much more delicate, isn't it?
It's very delicate, and it brings this gorgeous ripe strawberry. Other aromas I get, sometimes I get a hint of caramel, and I think that is from the saignée, because all of that is fermented in barrels. Old barrels, so you're not getting oak quality from the barrel, but you are, if you can imagine, a barrel fermenting, it's cylindrical or it's barrel shaped, so the fermentation just kind of moves around and around.
Roils.
As opposed to a tank where there's a little bit less of that natural sort of fermentation direction.
Right. And the fact that the wine is actually made in a barrel, and as Emily said, we call them actually neutral barrels. A neutral barrel is a barrel that gives no barrel flavor to the wine. But the advantage of using barrel, which is a very important asset with our rosé, is to give it structure and to give it a nice mouthfeel. And this wine, for its brightness and for its freshness, is also really very textural and very, very smooth to drink. It's a very nice rosé. It's not skinny, it's not thin, it's not watery. It's just got this lovely texture and viscosity, which we call mouthfeel.
Yes, absolutely. We have this rosé paired with a number of different options on our new and exciting venture that we start tomorrow. We've termed our venture Phase 2, that's the name of it, and it is our pop-up food and wine experience. Here in the tasting room, we've converted this space into a dining experience. You can go online and make a reservation, though reservations are not required at all. Chef Joel has put together a fantastic menu of small plates and slightly larger plates, and that the Phase 2 is open 11 until 5. Starting on Friday. Yes.
Yeah, and I want to ask you a few questions
Sure.
that have come in. Speaking of Provence, or where did you say that you went to get this?
Provence.
Yes.
Provence.
Is all rosé French?
Oh no, not at all. The majority of rosés, only because of the enormous volume that they produce in Provence and Languedoc and the Loire Valley, the market is sort of flooded with French wine, but in Italy they're called rosados, and in Spain it's rosato, and where there's a red grape, there's a rosé. I mean, it's as simple as that. And as Emily said, the rosés can vary from pale salmon-colored to really dark, almost red wine. The Australians make a sort of a Syrah with a rosé that I almost would say it was a red wine, but there's so much color in it.
That's actually another question that I received was, is darker mean that it's sweeter?
No, darker does not mean that it's sweeter at all. It typically means that either, number one, the juice sat in contact with the skin longer so that it extracted more color, or number two, that they've used a grape that has more color. For example, Syrah, or sometimes a Chambourcin, or a Tannat. All of those grapes are really richly, deeply colored reds. Yes. And so even if you do a very short amount of skin contact, it picks up color almost immediately. So it's not something that the winemaker can control. If it's a dark grape, it just picks up color really fast.
For example, I don't think we bleed the Petit Verdot.
No.
Our Petit Verdot has such amazing color that I think if Emily just tried to take some juice out of it, the rosé would be far too dark.
Yes.
Yeah. And the other grape that we grow that makes a very dark wine is Malbec and or Tannat.
So this one is not about rosé, but
okay.
Kelly would like to know if the Othello is coming back anytime soon.
Oh, wow, that's a fantastic question.
Othello Rosé?
No.
That'd be sweet, of course.
Yeah, so Othello is primarily made from our Tannat grape, and it's a port-style wine that we do. And actually, yes, I didn't realize that our inventory had run as low, so in 2020 will be our next vintage of Othello port-style wine. But unfortunately, Kelly, I think it's going to be 2022 before that hits the market. Port-style wines are a blessing and a curse. They are very challenging to make in that you have to get a fermentation going as hot and as vigorous as you can.
To extract the color in the fruit.
And then you have to stop it in its tracks so that you have that sweetness and that residual sugar by adding brandy. And it's quite difficult to get yeast to stop when they're going that.
I can remember when we first started, we thought, we read in the book, it said add alcohol and the fermentation stops. It doesn't.
It doesn't.
We had alcohol, then we had to cool it down, then we had to add sulfur dioxide, and eventually, with all the brakes on, we were able to stop the fermentation. But we do make Othello, and it's a very lovely wine, and perhaps we'll make an Othello Rosé.
And we do have an Othello Reserve, which was a blend of vintages, 06, 07, 08, 09, 10. It was, I think, 6 vintages up to 2011. That's in the library right now. You'll see that pop in and out of our library selections throughout the year. So if you're not already on our newsletter list or on our website, what do you call it, newsfeed? Sorry. Sign up for it, and anytime that comes out, we'll be sure that that's available to you.
And you can sign up for that at the bottom of any of our pages on our website.
Yes. Thank you, Becca.
And then the last question that I have today is, how well does rosé age?
It's not typically a wine you age.
Right.
I would go for current vintage, so right now look for 2019 rosés. There are some rosés, and it's become much more commonplace to build rosé for aging, but for the most part, rosés are built, and that was why the question came up, is it a white wine or a red wine? It's made from red grapes, but most of the winemaking strategy is a white strategy.
Yeah, but from red grapes.
From red grapes, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not typically made for aging. If you have a wine shop that you trust, you might ask them. There are a handful of rosés that are made that are fermented in oak that have longer skin contact times that are built for aging, but for the most part, as a general rule, drink now.
Right. But also, I think there is the mass-produced rosé, which is not intended to be taken seriously. There are some French wines. There's a region in the Rhone Valley called Tavel. All they make is rosé. It's an appellation in France, and they just make rosé.
And for the last
they're
hundreds
expensive.
And hundreds of years.
And they're expensive. Yep. And there's another one called Bandol in Provence, and they use a grape called Mourvèdre, which is a much darker grape, so the wine has got a lot more character to it. Many people would not like it too much because it's got actually too much character. I mean, one of the delights of rosé is that you don't have to think about it too much. You don't have to give it a lot of energy. So
those two would age very well. If you come into contact with those, don't worry about the vintage, trust the winemaker.
Right. And when Stephen Spurrier came here to do a dinner a couple of years ago, he chose a rosé, a Bandol, Chateau Tempier, and we tasted that, and it really was not the sort of rosé that you're used to. This was much more of a wine geek type of rosé.
It was, and it was beautiful with the meal, and held up to pretty much everything we tried to pair it with. So,
well, can I just put you on the spot then? What is your favorite rosé, each of you?
So my favorite rosé right now is the Mathiasen rosé out of California.
She's dropping names.
It's a Syrah-based rosé. I've been following Mathiasen for years. I was there about 5 years ago, and I have a great respect for their farming technique and their passion for wine, and it comes through in their rosé for sure.
Well, I'm afraid I have to go back to my Francophile leanings, and I go for the Southern Rhone Tavel, which I've tasted and which I rejoice in. But they're expensive. I mean, you're going to be paying $25, $30 a bottle for a tug up. But I bet you pay that for Andy Mathiasson. Because there is a Cabernet Rosé. Again, that's a darker wine, isn't it? With much more complexity than the Provence style.
But I will say here in Virginia, you can't go wrong with rosé. I have some favorites here as well. Early Mountain is doing a fantastic rosé. Cana Vineyards I think if she could just make rosé, she would just do that. So definitely, if you're local and you're here in Virginia, just look around to your neighbors and try their rosés, because a lot of the classic grape varietals are in all of these rosés that we're putting together. So enjoy celebrating International Rosé Day on Saturday and buy local. And also, one of our favorite things to do is also to buy local and then throw in some Francophile and California wines and wines from other areas, and it's really enjoyable to see how well this region is competing and showing, and you can see the passion in our wines as well.
I'd like just to add that in the local lineup of rosés, one of my local favourites is Stinson. I think they make an extremely good rosé. I think they use Tannat.
Yep, they do a few.
The Tannat grape. Stinson makes a lovely rosé. All the rosés in Virginia are good, and Veritas is up there with the rest of them. I've got to say that. I think it's time for us to wind up. Thank you very much for watching. I hope we've been able to enthuse you to drink rosé. And as we said last time and every time, please stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
And don't forget to make your reservation for Phase 2. And if you haven't bought your case of rosé on this incredible deal, it's still online till Monday.
But there's not much left.